Well, good morning to you all. I'm going to ask you to turn to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, that's where our study is going to begin, and largely will be located this morning. For those of you who are not attending our Bible class, we gave a little introduction to the series in there. We're talking about questions that come from the one with all the answers. And so these are not questions that we want to ask Jesus, because we all have those. But these are questions that we read in the Gospels that Jesus asks other people. And we made the point in class that the reason Jesus asks questions is never so that he can learn something about people, because he knows everything already. Jesus asks questions so that he can help us learn something about ourselves, to help us examine ourselves and see ourselves more clearly. In our class, we talked about what will a man give in exchange for his soul. And I've been the victim of my own poor planning. Psalm 16, I asked for that to be read to go with the first class. So that's my bad. That's my bad. And that's where I was going to end my class, right? The idea that at his right hand are pleasures forevermore. What could you possibly gain on earth that would be worth giving up? Those pleasures that are in his right hand. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about another question of Jesus. And that conversation begins in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38. Here in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this: "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I don't care who you are. That passage has to be one of the most challenging things that has ever been written in the history of mankind. On a carnal, in a worldly level, that passage starts to go south right after verse 38, right? Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And what we want to do is we want to cut it right there, say there's nothing else left in chapter 5, because that sounds great to me. Doesn't that sound great to you? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You hit me, I hit you. You knock out my tooth, I knock out your tooth. This sounds like a great way to be. This is a fair and just law for how people should deal with one another. It sounds like a perfectly fair standard. But then Jesus goes on, and he tells us that he expects more from us than that. He says if someone slaps you on the cheek, you turn the other cheek to him and let him slap the other one. If someone wants to sue you and take something from you, let him have your coat as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, well, then you walk with them too. You be that extra mile kind of person. And he chases all of that by saying, love your enemies and pray for your persecutors. And so ultimately in this passage, Jesus calls for something that is quite simply crazy and insane. He says, I don't want you to just refrain from hitting somebody back. I don't want you to just refrain from slinging insults back at somebody who's insulted you. But he goes beyond that. He says it's not enough. It's not enough to hit back. It's not enough to just stay neutral either. You have to go even further than that and actively seek to be a blessing in the lives of those who have done you wrong. When someone has done something to you that makes your life worse, it is now your job as the disciple of Jesus to go out and do something to make their life better. When your husband insults you, make him his favorite thing for dinner. Oof. When your wife disrespects you or says something that you feel was rude, go out and buy her some flowers. That's a challenging law, isn't it? That's a high standard. It's an incredible demand. You know, since we're reading this passage, I think it's important that we take a moment and emphasize that this is a legitimate command that Jesus actually expects us to follow. Can I say that again? This is a legitimate command, and Jesus actually expects us to do what he says here. I think sometimes what we do is we water down the words of Jesus. When Jesus says something like this, I want you to turn the other cheek, go the second mile, give to him who wants to sue you. When he says that, I think we look at that and we say, wow, isn't that crazy? Isn't it amazing that Jesus lived that kind of life? And the mistake we make is we look at that and we say, that's amazing. And then the second thing we say is, I could never do that. Right? And so we water down the words of Jesus and we pretend like this is just one of those radical commands that should just leave us in awe, but one that no one ever really expects us to follow because it's just so crazy. We use passages like this to evoke humility, but we don't allow them to generate change. But I want you to understand, brothers and sisters, this is a real command. This is a real expectation that Jesus has for us. We are disciples of Jesus. And we need to understand that disciples of Jesus tolerate physical violence that's perpetrated against them without taking revenge. Disciples of Jesus are those who give generously, not just to the people who are nice to us, but even to the ones who want to take from us. Christians, according to Romans 12, are the burning coal dumping kind of people. We don't return evil for evil, as Paul tells us there. Now, when you look at all of that and you read all of these great things about what Christians are supposed to do, how we're supposed to treat one another, sometimes there are people who have certain objections to that. And so I want to raise a few of those objections. Somebody says, this is the way we ought to be. We ought to treat people this way. There are some things that people say. And one of the first things people say is, we can never do that because if you do that, they will never learn. If you're the kind of person who lets people walk all over you, then you're just going to be a doormat your entire life. Nobody's ever going to learn anything. And they're never going to change. They're just going to treat you that way, use you and abuse you for the rest of your life. Well, if that's your objection, then I need to introduce you to Romans chapter 12, verse 21, where Paul says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so he actually tells us the way that you get people to stop treating you this way is with good, not with revenge, not with evil. And there are other people who might say, look, I'm not going to act that way. I'm not going to do that because ultimately that is an affront to human dignity. It is undignified to me as a human being, someone created in the image of God, to let someone treat me that way. It is undignified. And so not only is it uncomfortable to treat people that way, but it's just wrong. I've been made in the image of God, and I should not let people treat me that way. It's undignified. But I want you to see what Jesus says in verses 44 through 45 of Matthew 5, where he says, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so the person who says, look, that's undignified to treat people this way, what I'm going to say to them is, actually, it makes you like God. That's the point here. God is the kind of God who is good even to the people who rebel against him and spit in his face. He is good. He sends his rain even on the unrighteous. And so when you choose to be that way, you become a son of God. You become like God because that's what God does. It's not undignified to treat people this way. But maybe more fundamentally than all of that, somebody might raise this objection. Look, I cannot pray for those who persecute me. I cannot turn the other cheek because no one does that. That is not how anyone lives. That is not how anyone operates. People just do not do that kind of thing. Now, unlike the first two objections, that one's actually true. But I think that raises an important conversation that I think we ought to have. I think it raises an important conversation about how we examine ourselves and how we examine others. It raises an important conversation about our walk with Christ. And I want you to see that Jesus begins that conversation in the next couple of verses. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 through 48. And it's there that we're introduced to another question from the one with all the answers. Listen to what Jesus says here. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So in those 3 verses, Jesus raises a number of important questions, and we'll sum them up by simply saying it this way. This is the question that Jesus raises. What more are you doing than others? That's the question on the table this morning. That's the discussion that I think we need to have in the area in which we need to examine ourselves. So in this passage, Jesus really asks 2 questions. He says, look, if you love people who love you, then what reward do you have? If you're the kind of person who is nice to people, if you're the kind of person who doesn't slap the people who don't slap you, then what reward do you have? What good have you done? How are you any different than anybody else? And he follows that by asking this question. If you greet only your brothers, then what more are you doing than others? If the only people that you're nice to are the people that you know, the people that you're related to, the people that you go to church with, the neighbor that you've been friends with for 20 years, if those are the people that you greet warmly, then what more are you doing than other people at the end of the day? What more are you doing than others? Because at the end of the day, that's what everyone does. This is how everyone lives. If this is how you live your life, where you love the people who love you, where you greet the people warmly who are your brothers, who have been nice to you, then how is your life distinct? How have you changed the standard? How are you different than anybody else around you? Why should anyone pat you on the back? Why should anyone give you extra credit on this assignment? Because at the end of the day, this is what everyone does. There is no challenge in loving the people who love you. There's nothing commendable about offering a warm welcome to a brother or an ally. Because that's what everyone does, isn't it? You know, that's one of the funny things that we do as Christians, as disciples sometimes, is we come into this place and we see all these people who smile at us and shake our hand and are nice to us, that we see every Sunday, and we're nice back to them, right? And so they invite us out to lunch and they pay, and we do that whole thing. We're like, no, you're not going to pay for me. They're like, yeah, I'm going to pay for you. And then you kind of reach for the check, but you're not really reaching for it. And then they pay for you. You're like, that was nice. And then then next Sunday, like, well, we got to take you out to lunch, do you the favor, you know? And so then you do the whole thing again, but it's backwards. Like, they try to reach, but you say, no, I'm going to pay, and, you know, all that stuff. And so that's what we do. And we're nice to the people. We invite them over to our house, and their kids come over, and we're nice to their kids, and they're nice to our kids. We may do Thanksgiving together, and we love these people, and they've been so nice to us, and that's what we do. And then we pat ourselves on the back, and we say, aren't we loving people? Aren't we special? Don't we deserve a pat on the back because we're so good at loving our fellow man? But what Jesus is calling us to appreciate here in this question, in these verses, is that's what everyone does, isn't it? That's what everyone does. Do you know who else is nice to those who are nice to them? Do you know who else loves those who love them? Do you know who else greets only their brothers? Tax collectors. Tax collectors do that. Crooked, perverted tax collectors who steal money from people who are in a helpless situation, they love the people who love them. And they greet the people who greet them. Notice that when Jesus came to earth, tax collectors like to eat with each other. They hung out. Do you know who else does that? Prostitutes. They love those who love them, and they warmly greet the people who warmly greet them. crooked politicians, drug cartels, murderers, terrorist organizations, all love those who love them. All of them greet their brothers warmly, don't they? Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and that rotund man in North Korea, they all are nice to the people who are nice to them, because that's the way it works. That's what everyone does. And so Jesus asked the question, if that's all you do, if all you do is treat people nicely who are nice to you, what more are you doing than others? How is your life any different? Why should you get extra credit? Why should you get a pat on the back? And his point in asking this question is not to instigate some spiritual rivalry, although it might sound like that, right? It might sound like he's saying, hey, look around at your church, and you need to say, I'm going to do more than that guy over there. That's not the point of this question. His point is, I want you to look around at the world that you inhabit. I want you to look around at the world that you live in. And I want you to look at the way that normal, civilized people behave. Normal, civilized, worldly people behave. And I want you to notice something about them. That they're nice to people who are nice to them. That they're generous to the people who are generous with them. And they warmly welcome the people they know. And so if all I do as a Christian is meet that same standard, what more am I doing than others? If all I do as a Christian is ignore all that stuff that Jesus says in Matthew 5 about turning the other cheek and going the extra mile and giving to him who wants to sue me, if I'm unwilling to do all of that and all I'm willing to do is say, if you're my brother, I'm going to love you because you're nice to me, then how am I different at all from the civilized, worldly person? Back in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, Jesus would say this. Matthew 5 and verse 13. When he's introducing the kingdom and talking about the qualities of a kingdom citizen, he says, look, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? Another question from Jesus, by the way. It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. And the point that Jesus makes there is, look, you're the salt of the earth. And the point of the salt is salt is supposed to have flavor. If the salt doesn't have any taste, if it doesn't have any flavor in it, then what good is it, right? There's no good for it. You just throw it out and it's trampled by men. Because if your salt doesn't have any flavor, it's not going to make your mashed potatoes any better. And if your Christians don't act any different, then it's not going to make this world any different. And nobody's going to notice that they're different, and they're not going to have any effect. And so the point of this question from Jesus is that the world has certain standards. Standards for how you treat people. Standards for how you interact with people. And his point is this, that the Christian ought to make it their mission to far exceed that standard. What more? What more are you doing than others? Now, what I want to do at this point is, I want to take this concept and I want to kind of zoom out a little bit. Because we talked about our treatment of other people. And we've talked about turning the other cheek. And we talked about how we need to treat people better than the regular, ordinary, worldly person would treat other people. But I think you can take that question. What more are you doing than others? And I think you can broaden it out. I think the implications go much further than just not punching somebody in the face when they punch you. I think it's a question that we can ask that relates to Matthew 5, verse 13, about whether or not we really are the salt of the earth. We can ask in every facet of our life, in every relationship in our life, in everything that we do in our life. That question, what more are you doing than others, is an important question to ask ourselves in so many different facets and lanes. Are we the kind of people that simply walk through this world and meet the standard expectations of worldly people? Or are we the kind of people who actually live differently and are committed to living differently than other people. I wonder, brothers and sisters, if we have any salt in us. I wonder if we really do raise our standard. I wonder if we were going to ask ourselves, how is your life any different than the life of the polite atheist who lives 3 doors down? Would you think about that? Would you really dig into that question and think about that this morning? How is the life that you live as a Christian, aside from the fact that you come to worship on Sunday morning, right? Aside from the fact that you're not there for an hour and a half, longer than that, 3 hours, something like that. Aside from that fact, how is your life different from the polite atheist who lives 3 doors down? I wonder what would happen if, I don't know, you can pick any person, but I wonder what would happen if we got 2 private detectives and we hired 2 private detectives to follow you guys around, right? And they were going to document everything you did and everything the atheist did for a whole week. And they were going to document how you responded in all kinds of different situations. When you got punched in the face, all right, what did he do? We're going to write it down. When you had something come up at work that required you to show some courage, okay, what did each one of them do? When it came to giving generously or passing some homeless person on the side of the street, okay, what did each one of these people do? If we wrote down everything that the 2 of you did, how would those lists compare? Between you, the person who claims to be a follower of Christ, and the regular, civilized, worldly person. How distinct would you be? What more would you have done than others? And I wonder if we can get even more specific in that regard. I wonder what would happen if that's really small. I'm sorry, I hope you guys can read that. What if they looked at you and that polite atheist and they said, how did each one of these people handle their anger? When you were angry about something, when you were really frustrated about something during that week when they were cataloging everything that you did, how did you handle that? And how was that any different than how the regular, ordinary, worldly person lived? Was there any difference at all? You know, regular worldly people, when they feel anger, they vent it out. They let their frustrations out, and they lash out at other people, and they let it all go because they're angry, and they feel that emotion, and they want you to feel it too. And they hang on to their anger, right? They let the anger culminate inside of them, and they let it foment into bitterness and ugliness and grudges and all kinds of stuff like that. The Christians, we're the kind of people who don't let the sun go down on our anger. And we do not give the devil a foothold in our lives through our anger. That's what Ephesians 4 says. Is that what those private detectives would find if they compared your life to the life of the regular atheist? Here's a tough one. What if they saw your internet history? What if they had access to everything that you searched and everything that you looked for, and maybe if we can get a little political, to everything you said about politics online during this week? What would they find? Would they find that in your life, when it comes to what you say and how you present yourself and the images that you're looking at, would they find that you are doing more than the regular worldly person? What if they saw what you wore and not just what you wore to church? What if they saw the way that you dressed outside of church? When you weren't here and the elders weren't watching and the old ladies weren't watching, what would they find when they saw the way that you dressed, the way that you conducted yourself? In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9, it says, likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments. We are supposed to be the kind of people who watch the way we dress. We cannot dress like the rest of the world. This is something that is supposed to make a statement about who we are. Does your clothing, does what you wear, the way you present yourself, does your modesty come out in what you put on? Would they find any difference between you and the atheist living down the street? What if they saw how you forgave others? Or whether or not you did forgive others? What if they encountered you and that other person in those situations where somebody really did you wrong? They really did something against you. This isn't just an issue of you having a pet peeve or being a little irritable that day. This is somebody who really did you wrong. Regular worldly people, they don't forgive that kind of stuff, at least not easily and not quickly. But Christians, we're the kind of people who forgive people up to 7 times every single day. Probably more than that, technically. What would they find when it came to how you practice forgiveness? Would they find that you do more than others? That you forgive to a greater degree than other people in the world? What if they saw a detailed credit card bill? They saw where you spent your money and how you spent your money. Would they find that you do more than others? That you're not just buying stuff, you're not just living this life for yourself, but really you see your money as something that has been given to you by God. You see yourself as a steward of your finances, and you use that money with generosity and with wisdom, and you don't just blow it all so that you can enjoy yourself here on this earth. When it comes to your money, what more are you doing than others? Or how about this one? What if they saw your evangelistic efforts? I wonder, it's really funny to me that sometimes atheists are wonderful evangelists. Have you noticed that? When you go on a college campus, that guy who's the atheist, who's read all the Richard Dawkins books, he's a super evangelist. He wants to tell everybody what he's found. He wants to tell everybody what he believes, and he wants to tell everybody, he wants everyone to believe exactly what he believes about evolution, about atheism, about how there is no God. He wants to make all the arguments. He's done all the study and everything like that. Would those detectives find that an atheist is more readily willing to share his faith than you're willing to share yours? We are supposed to be the kind of people who spread the good news, who spread the gospel of Jesus Christ to our world with every fiber of our being. That's why we're here. That's why we've been created. That's what He intends for us to do, to bear fruit with our lives, to seek and save the lost. Would He find that in that regard we are doing more than others? Or are we just quietly going about our business, trying to lead a quiet life without ruffling feathers? What if they saw how you spent your time? I don't know why that didn't click. There we go. What if they saw how you spent your time? Would they find that you spent your time devoting yourself to spiritual things, to thinking about spiritual things, to study of the Word of God, to praising God in song? Would they find that you had a great prayer life? Or would they find that you live life pretty much like everybody else? You come here on Sunday, you sing your songs, you get your prayers in then, but other than that, you're just disconnected from spiritual things. You're not focused on that at all. I guess there's a million more questions we could ask. I've got no more on the slide. But at the end of the day, that's a question that I think we all ought to ask ourselves. What more are you doing than others? Does your life reflect that you simply comply with the standard expectations of regular, worldly, civilized people? Or do you truly live that salt and light kind of life? Are you devoted to Jesus in an extreme and in a radical way? Are you willing to do whatever He asks, no matter how out of touch that may be with our society? Are you willing to do more than what regular worldly people do, but you are ready to give literally your whole life to Jesus and to His cause and to follow Him with everything that you've got? You know, one of the biggest mistakes that I think we can make, one of the biggest mistakes that I have made, is just kind of living on American autopilot. It's just simply looking around at the people that are in this world with me, looking at my neighbors, looking around, and basically just living to their standard. And I think we need to remember that this society, that this world, that the people we're surrounded by, they are not our standard. They are not the people that's not the standard that we're trying to meet. We need to remember that we're living in Babylon, that we are living in a world that has rejected God, that has rebelled against God, and we are living among people, the vast majority of which will not spend eternity with God. We need to remember that the regular, everyday, average person is not on the path that leads to life, and that if we want to get on the path, we have to raise our standards. We have to be the kind of person who does more than others. And so I ask you, brothers and sisters, take some time today to find a moment that's free from distraction, away from the phone, away from the kids, if you can possibly find that place, and really dig into that question. In my life, the way that I live every day, what more am I doing than others? Am I a radical, extreme follower of Jesus? Or am I just doing basically what everybody else is doing? That's an important question to ask. And I hope that you could ask it honestly. And I would remind you that there's a purpose and there's a reason why we try to do more than others. That we're not trying to do more because we think we're better people, or we think we're superior to them, or we're some kind of extra special human being that God created. We don't do it because we think we're better. We do it because we've been saved by Jesus. And as Paul says in Ephesians 4, we are to walk worthy of the calling with which we have been called. In that, to live an extraordinary kind of life in the service of Jesus, that is how we walk worthy of the calling to which we've been called. That is how we walk in a way that is worthy of the salvation that we have been given. We have been transformed. We have been set free. We have been changed by Jesus Christ. And we dedicate our lives to Him because that's what He deserves, because of what He's done for us. And so as we bring this lesson to a close, I ask you to consider, what more are you doing than others? But I also ask you that if you're sitting in this audience today and you have not been changed by Jesus, I ask you, why not? I want to remind you that most everybody in this world will not give their life to Jesus, but that is no reason for you not to do the same. That this morning there is water ready, that if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you're willing to repent of your sins, if you're willing to live a life that is radically different, and you're willing to confess that before men, then you can be baptized in water and have your sins washed away. You can be transformed. You can be changed. You can rise to walk in newness of life, to live a different kind of life. If we can help you do that, if we can help you do anything else, we invite you to come to the front while we stand and while we sing.